Eli Whitlow leaned forward on the steering wheel, his breath fogging the cab glass as the big house came into view beyond the frost-warped hedges. Ashenford Hall stood on its rise, like something pulled out of a different century altogether, its gables blackened with lichen, its stone walls grooved by 400 years of storms. It didn't look like a bargain so much as a dare, and that was what the villagers had treated it as when they'd watched him sign the papers. Too cheap, too fast, and no one in the valley had wanted it, not even the developers who sniffed at land like dogs sniffing a carcass. But Eli needed acreage more than he needed peace, and he'd told himself that stone was stone, and timber was timber, no matter what history pressed down through it. Beside him in the passenger seat, Mara hugged her coat tighter and kept her eyes on the looming silhouette. She hadn't said much since they'd left their old farmhouse for the last time that morning. Her sketchbook lay closed on her lap, the graphite smudge of her thumb, the only sign she'd been drawing during the drive. When Eli cut the engine, silence rushed in, a silence heavier than mere countryside quiet, one that seemed to carry its own breath. Mara stirred, brushing back a lock of hair that had escaped her scarf. "It's older than it looked last time." Eli grunted, half in agreement, half in defiance. Older means stronger. They built things to last back then. That roof stood since Charles was king. Ours barely made it 40 years. He climbed down from the cab, the engine's rumble fading into the restless wind. His boots sank deep into the damp verge, squelching as water rose around the leather seams. The cold struck him instantly, sharp as a nail driven through his chest, the kind of chill that seemed to bypass the skin and bury itself in bone. He stood still for a moment, breath steaming, eyes narrowing against the gust that whipped through the rye. Behind him the field bent under the gale, a restless tide of stalks leaning and bowing, their rustle more than mere sound. It was a shushing, low and ceaseless, like 1,000 whispered warnings passing from stalk to stalk, hushed voices speaking in a language too old for him to understand. Mara descended more slowly from the tractor, her boots hesitant against the metal rungs. She kept one hand braced against the side of the cab, steadying herself, while the other instinctively brushed across her belly. It had become her constant gesture since the test, an unconscious reassurance, a reminder that every step she took was no longer hers alone. 5 months now. The swell of her middle showed beneath her coat, and though the doctor had told her to rest, she insisted on coming, insisted on seeing with her own eyes what their future might look like. Eli watched her, his eyes lingering on the curve of her hand as it rested against her middle. His heart pulled tight in his chest, a knot he carried more often now than not. 5 months. The number echoed in him like a tolling bell, steady and undeniable. 5 months had transformed everything. How he walked the fields, how he measured the seasons, how he thought about the future. It was no longer just the two of them bracing against the world. There was another life threading itself quietly, invisibly, into theirs, and the weight of that truth sat on his shoulders at every waking moment. 5 months was enough to turn every decision heavy. Every choice about seed or soil or roof repair seemed to reverberate outward, stretching into years he hadn't even lived yet. The hours themselves felt urgent, as though time had narrowed, each day another stone dropped into a jar that would never refill. The freedom he once felt in risk, the gambler's flicker of daring when he borrowed money for seed, when he worked rented land without knowing if it would pay back, was gone. Now, there was no luxury in uncertainty. Every risk was measured against the sound of a child's first cry he had not yet heard. It was enough to make him push harder than he thought himself capable. Harder for expansion, harder for more than the thin scraps of rented ground they had scraped life from in the years behind them. He had grown tired of patching roofs on someone else's barns, of sowing seed on soil he'd never own, of yielding profits to men who had inherited their land rather than fought for it. Each morning he felt it sharper, the demand to carve out a place that was theirs alone, something lasting, something he could pass forward. And so Ashenford's 20 acres stretched before him in his mind, even before they'd signed the deed. Rye fields and meadow, tangled and neglected, standing half wild beneath the weight of years of abandonment. To anyone else it might look like ruin, another money pit, another old house too tired to rise again. But to Eli, it was a canvas, a place where his labor might mean something, where his child might one day run through grass that bowed only to their name. The thought of it set a fire in his chest. Ashenford no longer seemed like a risk. It gleamed instead as promise, a door cracked open to a future that could be held, shaped, defended, a salvation they had been given by chance or fate, and one they had to claim with both hands, whatever its cost. They set off down the last stretch on foot, tractor left behind, the ruts too deep and the mud too heavy for wheels to manage. Each step dragged at their boots, the earth greedy, sucking at soles with a noise like breath. The drive ahead was little more than churned mud and weeds, a scar where gravel had once lain. Stones had either been stolen by hands long gone or swallowed by the soil itself, leaving behind a path uneven and treacherous. The house rose before them as they trudged, its outline stark against the dimming sky. Shutterless windows greeted them, each gaping black, blank as empty sockets in a skull. No glass glimmered, no curtains stirred, just voids that watched without blinking. The slate roof sagged, moss thick in its seams, yet the walls still held, broad and unyielding despite centuries of neglect. At the threshold loomed the great door, oak darkened with age, its weight bowed on iron hinges corroded to green. The metal looked ready to crumble at the touch, flaked with rust like dried blood. Yet when Eli drew the new key from his pocket, its brass bright against the gloom, something within him steadied. He slid it into the lock, half expecting resistance, the grind of disuse. But when he turned, the mechanism yielded at once, smoother than he imagined possible, smoother than any door in their own farmhouse. The tumblers shifted with a muted click, the sound almost welcoming. The door shivered slightly inward, as though the house itself had drawn breath. For a moment Eli's hand froze on the key, his skin prickling with the uncanny thought that they had not forced entry at all, but answered a summons. The lock had not resisted, not even hesitated. It had given way eagerly, willingly, as if the house had been waiting for this very moment. The air that spilled out was thick with damp stone, soot, and something older, the way unopened trunks sometimes smelled in the loft of his grandfather's barn. Mara coughed into her sleeve. Eli told himself the stench would pass once they got a fire going, once the chimneys breathed again. They stepped into the hall, and the door closed behind them with a thud that carried too much weight for timber alone. The sound reverberated through the space, echoing longer than it should have, as if the house itself repeated it back to them. Mara stiffened at the noise, glancing over her shoulder, but the door had already sealed into its frame, solid and impenetrable, shutting them in as neatly as a clasped box. The ceiling soared far above, a vault of shadows broken by heavy oak beams. Time had warped them, bending their lengths like ribs under strain, yet still they held firm, their dark wood unbroken. Etched across their surfaces were marks Eli did not recognize. Shallow scratches, uneven circles, slanted crosses that seemed too ordered to be mere accidents. They covered the beams in uneven clusters, some so faint they looked like stains, others gouged deep as if cut with a deliberate hand. At the far side of the hall, a staircase rose into darkness, each step vanishing into a band of shadow that refused the lantern's glow. The banister gleamed where countless hands had polished it smooth over centuries, a river of touch carved into its grain. Near the center, suspended by a chain too thin for its burden, hung a chandelier vast enough to dwarf a wagon wheel. It sagged askew, its weight straining the links. The candle stubs clinging to its sockets had long ago melted to shapeless nubs, their wax hardened into brittle drips that clung like stalactites. Eli tilted his head back, breath drawing deep into his chest. The air smelled of dust and damp stone, yet beneath it lay something else. A gravity, a presence that pressed down on him. His words came low, reverent despite the cold. 400 years, he murmured, half to Mara, half to himself. This place has outlasted wars, plagues, whole dynasties. It'll outlast us too. His voice faded into the echoing vastness, as though the house itself were considering his claim. Mara said nothing at first. She reached into her satchel and pulled free her sketchbook, its leather cover cracked, corners bent from long use. She flipped it open, thumb brushing past half-filled pages of their journey until she found a blank one. Her pencil moved almost immediately, as if the act of drawing steadied her nerves where words could not. She didn't smile, not even faintly, but her eyes narrowed with focus as the leads scratched softly over the paper. Lines emerged, the sharp angle of the hall's arch, the crooked sag of the chandelier, the fractured light slanting through a cracked windowpane high on the wall. Dust motes drifted in the pale beam, and she caught them too, shading their scatter like a constellation. Her concentration softened the tension in her posture, a quiet refuge against the weight of the place. Eli watched her a long moment, lantern hanging at his side. The sight warmed him, eased something in his chest that had tightened since they'd crossed the threshold. For all the strangeness pressing in, Mara remained steady, her pencil tracing order from ruin. It gave him courage. He straightened, adjusted the strap biting into his shoulder, and finally bent to grasp their duffel bag. With a grunt, he hefted it from the floor, shifted its weight against his hip, and carried it toward the kitchen. The kitchen had once been the heart of the hall, a cavern with soot-black rafters and a hearth large enough to roast an ox. Now it was bare, but for a cracked stone sink, a rusted pump, and a scullery door hanging from one hinge. Mice had claimed the corners, and a nest of swallows stirred from the chimney when Eli struck a match to test the flue. Their wings rattled in the dark like dry leaves, then were gone. By evening they had managed, through stubborn effort and weary hands, to haul the old mattress up to a chamber on the second floor. Dust rose with every step of the stairs, the faded carpet groaning beneath the weight of their climb. The room they chose was far from welcoming. Plaster cracked like dry riverbeds across the walls, window glass so fogged it blurred the trees outside into shapeless shadows. Yet the beams overhead felt solid when Eli tested them, and the floorboards did not bow beneath their weight. It was enough. When Mara finally lay back on the mattress, one hand pressed protectively against her stomach, her face softened, the tautness around her eyes easing for the first time since they had arrived. A fragile peace settled over her features. Eli lowered himself beside her, exhaustion dragging at his muscles. He lay flat, eyes fixed on the dark canopy of rafters above, their angles lost in shadow. His mind was full of half-formed questions, but slowly the stillness pressed down, urging his body to surrender. At last, his eyelids grew heavy, and sleep began to draw him under. It wasn't sleep that woke him later, but sound. A dull, hollow knock rising from the bones of the house. He froze, every nerve sharpened. The knock came again, steady, measured, too deliberate to be timber shifting, too rhythmic to be accident. It pulsed through the floorboards like a heartbeat far too large to belong to anything human. Eli held his breath, ears straining. He counted the seconds, waiting. Another knock followed, deeper this time, as though it travelled up through layers of stone. Mara stirred beside him, her voice thick with sleep. "Did you hear?" He hushed her quickly, pressing a hand to her arm. "Quiet," he whispered, his voice almost lost in the darkness. He strained to listen again, chest tight, the silence between knocks louder than thunder. For a long moment there was nothing, and he told himself lies to soothe the fear building in his chest. It was the beams shifting. The draught pushing through old pipes, rats tumbling through the pantry. Nothing more. Nothing that meant danger. But then it came again, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. The sound throbbed like something alive, then faded once more into stillness. Eli remained rigid, unable to close his eyes, listening to every breath of the house, every groan of the rafters. Long after the sound ceased, he stayed awake, pinned beneath the weight of a silence so complete it pressed down like stone. The following morning broke grey and thin, light struggling through the fogged window panes. Eli did not wait for breakfast, or for words. He pulled on his boots with hands that shook, and without explaining, headed straight for the cellar. The steps complained beneath his weight, each one groaning as though resenting his intrusion. The edges were crumbling, damp, gnawing away at the wood. His lantern flame wavered in the draught, illuminating walls slick with moisture. The smell of earth hung thick here, heavier than before, sharp and metallic, as if iron bled unseen through the soil. He counted the chambers beneath the house, 3 in total, each opening from the narrow passage like secrets, unwilling to be told. The first he entered was cluttered, piled with broken chairs, their legs snapped and tangled, their backs warped with rot. Rusted farm tools leaned drunkenly in corners, their edges blunted by neglect, still dangerous in their silence. The second chamber sagged under its own abandonment. Barrels long since staved in lay scattered, their hoops bent and twisted, their wood splintered into heaps of useless fragments. The air was thick with the stale smell of grain long rotted into powder, mingled with the sting of mold. The third chamber was different. Its emptiness was immediate, striking in contrast to the others. The walls were bare, the floor swept clean of debris, as though someone had taken care to strip it of all trace. Nothing lingered there but a line of shadows, and at the far side a single arrangement, a row of crates. Eli frowned, lantern light painting sharp lines across his face. The emptiness didn't sit right in his bones. The cellar walls had been unyielding everywhere else, but here the silence felt off, wrong, as though the stones themselves were lying. He pressed his palm flat to the back wall, then curled his knuckles and rapped. The sound that came back made him freeze. It was not the dull solidity of stone, but something else entirely, an echo faint yet undeniable, the whisper of a hollow space concealed just beyond. His breath caught. He rapped again, harder this time. The noise returned different, stretched, almost cavernous. That echo slid into his chest and clamped tight around his heart, filling him with a tangle of fear and a surge of possibility. That night, seated before the fire they had coaxed to life in the kitchen hearth, Eli tried to put words to what he had heard. The flames popped and hissed, shadows rippling across the worn floorboards. Mara sat with her sketchbook propped on her knees, pencil tracing the faint outlines of a window frame. When he spoke, her hand faltered mid-stroke, the pencil stilling as though the paper itself had stiffened beneath it. "A hidden room," she repeated, looking up at him. Her eyes widened, the reflection of the flames dancing in their dark centers. Why would anyone wall up a room? Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the coals, as if the answer might be hidden in their red glow. He shrugged, though his pulse betrayed the casualness. "Could be a priest hole," he murmured, his voice thick with unease. "Could be some kind of storage space. Could be nothing at all." But even as he said it, his blood ran quick, full of the possibilities clawing at his imagination. Mara's gaze dropped. She set her sketchbook aside with a soft thump, fingers lingering on the cover before moving to her belly, a gesture so instinctive it sent a fresh shiver through him. "Or," she whispered, voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire, "it could be something that wasn't meant to be found." Neither spoke for a long while after that. The fire dipped low, sighing into embers, and the house pressed in on them with its shifting creaks, as though listening. Eli tried to imagine what lay beyond the wall, but every image came dark, every vision incomplete. Mara dozed against his shoulder at last, but he remained awake, staring into the black of the chimney throat, hearing the echo again and again in his mind. They waited until Saturday to act, the days crawling past in a haze of tension. Each morning Eli walked the perimeter of the house, restless, glancing back at the cellar door as though the wall below might crumble on its own. Mara busied herself with sketches, with meals half eaten, her silence heavy with both dread and inevitability. When the morning finally came, Eli fetched the sledgehammer from the tractor shed. The tool was heavy, its oak haft scarred and darkened by decades of use. The metal head dulled with rust, yet solid enough to break through anything less stubborn than bedrock. He tested its weight in his grip, then carried it down into the cellar, where the lantern already glowed. Mara was waiting, pale in its trembling light, her features carved sharp by shadow. She said nothing, only shifted the lantern higher, her knuckles white on the handle. Eli took position before the wall. For a heartbeat he stood motionless, the silence deep and absolute. Then he raised the hammer high and swung. The strike cracked like a bell, reverberating through the chamber, shaking dust loose in choking veils from the rafters above. He coughed, grit filling his throat, and swung again. The mortar shivered under the blows, flakes cascading down in grey streams. Blow after blow followed, each strike louder, harsher, sending tremors through the old bones of the house. Mortar cracked, brick loosened, the wall groaning with resistance before finally beginning to yield. Sweat ran down Eli's back, the sledgehammer dragging his arms heavier with each swing. Mara's lantern swayed, throwing wild shadows that leapt across the stone like figures dancing in mockery. At last, a fissure split open, narrow at first, then widening, jagged edges crumbling outward. From it seeped the stale breath of another chamber, a draught colder than the cellar air, smelling of stone sealed too long from light. Eli lowered the hammer, chest heaving, as that first foul breath touched their faces, until a fissure split wide enough for the stale breath of another chamber to seep through. It smelled of mildew and iron, a rank heaviness that clung to the throat and burned the nostrils, the odor of things left too long in the dark, forgotten, but never at rest. The door's groan still echoed faintly behind them as Eli stepped through first, the lantern trembling in his grip. Its dim glow carved narrow paths through shadow, revealing more than he wished and less than he needed. He raised it higher, his other hand brushing the damp stone for balance. Mara lingered at the threshold, her body rigid, as if the darkness might swallow her whole if she dared to move. Yet the silence of the passage behind was worse, and at last she stepped in after him, her reluctance plain in the way her fingers clutched the back of his coat, unwilling to be left even a pace behind. The hidden chamber opened wider than either had expected. Its stone walls were rough-hewn, not the careful masonry of a cellar, but something older, carved with haste or secrecy. Water seeped from the cracks, leaving the stones slick, and every breath drew in the sting of damp lime. The air here was colder, unnaturally so, a chill that pressed through their coats and sank to the bone. The ceiling arched low, heavy beams sagging beneath centuries of neglect, draped in cobwebs that trembled at the faintest stir of air. Dust lay thick across the floor, muffling their footsteps until they felt like intruders walking in someone else's dream. Shapes loomed in the gloom, hulking and misshapen under the rot of old cloths. To Eli's eyes they were grotesque silhouettes, monsters crouched in waiting, but as the lantern's glow steadied, their forms resolved into a cabinet leaning against the wall, a trunk bolted shut, and parcels stacked in deliberate rows, each covered with sacking eaten by moth and mildew. Mara's breath rasped beside him, the sound loud against the stillness. Eli swallowed hard, then bent to the nearest parcel. The cloth tore like parchment under his hand, disintegrating into flakes that drifted into the air. Beneath lay an old flintlock pistol, the barrel mottled green with corrosion, but its shape unmistakable. He held the lantern closer, and the dull gleam of metal winked back at him, mocking in its persistence. His fingers moved to the next. Another cloth peeled away, this time revealing a powder horn etched with faint designs, lines spiraling into symbols he didn't recognize. The leather strap, brittle and cracking, broke apart at his touch. Mara made a sound behind him, half gasp, half protest, but Eli pressed on. The third parcel revealed a knife, its blade jagged, cruel, as though forged for something more than utility. The handle was worn smooth with use, the wood polished by hands long turned to dust. He felt the weight of it in the air, even without lifting it, a residue of intent that lingered long after the wielder was gone. Mara's breath caught. Her voice was barely audible, yet it carried through the chamber as if amplified by the stone. "These aren't heirlooms," she whispered, her eyes wide, throat tight. "They're weapons." Eli let the cloth fall from his hands, his pulse loud in his ears. The lantern flame sputtered, throwing the chamber into sudden, erratic shadow. It was then that Mara noticed something at the far wall, half hidden in gloom. She took an uneasy step closer, lantern light grazing the surface. Strange marks scratched into the stone caught her eye, a chaos of carvings etched deep. Circles intersecting circles, crosses within squares, spirals that wound into themselves again and again until the stone was scarred with grooves. Some marks were shallow, new, while others had been carved so deep the rock had split. She lifted her hand but stopped short of touching them, as though to do so might invite something back into the world. Her skin prickled, every hair along her arms rising. She shivered, clutching her coat tighter. Eli opened the trunk. The hinges groaned, a long metallic sigh, as if the wood itself regretted yielding its secrets. Inside lay a bundle of papers bound with brittle twine, the knot stiff with age, the edges curled, the ink blurred, yet still legible under the trembling lantern light. Grain tallies, names in long columns, some struck through, others circled. and at the head of each page, in stark black, a single word, tithe. Eli flipped a page. His stomach lurched as he read the annotations scrawled in a cramped, hurried hand. 3 lambs, 2 casks, 1 child. Mara's breath caught. She staggered back as though the very air had struck her. No. The word cracked from her lips, no louder than a breath, but sharp enough to split the silence. Her hand clutched the doorway, knuckles white, as her eyes fixed on the list as though seeing it too long would stain her soul. It can't mean that. The weight of it pressed down on Eli's chest. He felt his throat tighten, felt the words he might have spoken shrivel and die before they could reach her. He could not soften what was written. He could not pretend the letters didn't spell exactly what they spelled. With a grim, deliberate motion, he shut the trunk. The lid fell with a thud that echoed through the cellar, shaking dust from the rafters. He set the lantern firmly on top, as though sheer weight could pin the horrors inside, as though wood and metal could bind the past and keep it from spilling into their present. That night the house seemed restless, unsettled, alive in ways it had no right to be. Doors creaked open, though Eli had latched them with care. Floorboards whispered under phantom steps. No matter how much wood he fed the fire, the flames guttered low, shrinking to a sullen glow, as if the hearth itself resisted warmth. Mara tossed in their narrow bed, her skin slick with sweat. She woke screaming once, then again, clutching her belly, her voice shredded with terror. "They're watching," she gasped. "They were all around me, masked figures, circling. She choked back sobs, shivering as she added, "They weren't pointing at me, Eli. They were pointing here." Her palm pressed her stomach as though to shield it from something unseen. Eli pulled her close, rocking her in his arms, whispering comfort he could not believe himself. He murmured her name, murmured promises that sounded hollow even in his own ears. Yet he kept speaking, because silence was worse, because silence gave the shadows permission to whisper back. The nights dragged. Wind howled against the eaves, voices hidden in its currents. The shutters rattled, and more than once Eli thought he saw shapes crossing the threshold of the yard, lingering just beyond the lantern's glow, watching. He told himself it was mist, tricks of the eye, nothing more. But when he turned to Mara, he found the same dread mirrored in her wide, sleepless stare. Days later, when Eli could bear the weight no longer, he placed the call. He expected delay. The station was 30 miles distant across winding roads. Yet within the hour, the police arrived. Constable Harrow and Inspector Bellamy stepped from their car in perfect silence, boots crunching on the gravel in unison. Their coats were buttoned high, their eyes sharp, unreadable. They wasted no time with greetings. Their flashlights cut clean swaths through the gloom as they descended into the cellar. Eli followed, lantern in hand, the light shaking in rhythm with his breath. Mara stood on the steps, pale and rigid, unwilling to follow further. The men stepped into the hidden room with practiced ease, as though they had always known it was there. Their beams swept across the walls lined with rusted tools, shadows leaping at their command. They lingered on the weapons, blades, iron hooks, things whose purpose Eli dared not imagine. They inspected the trunk, fingers brushing the warped wood, the twine still wound around the bundle of papers. Neither spoke. Their lights passed next to the knife, its edge blackened though it gleamed where it caught the beam. And then, finally, to the smallest and most terrible of discoveries, the bundle of bones Mara had found in a small box wrapped in cloth. "Yes," Harrow said, voice clipped, a razor cutting through the stale air. "It's as reported." The weight of his words hung like iron chains. Bellamy didn't flinch. He only turned, slow as frost creeping over glass, and fixed Eli with a stare that carried no warmth at all. His eyes were cold, flat, the kind that never reflected back what they saw. "Seal it again," Bellamy said, each syllable deliberate, heavy, final. "This room is not for you." Eli's jaw tightened. The fluorescent light above buzzed, catching the dust motes between them like tiny suspended witnesses. He squared his shoulders, anger rising sharp in his chest. "This is evidence. A crime scene. You should." But Harrow's gaze snapped to him, quiet and merciless, and the words withered on Eli's tongue. It wasn't just authority in those eyes. It was warning, centuries old, coiled like a serpent that did not need to strike twice. "You'll do as instructed," Harrow said, voice lower now, steadier, more dangerous. "Some doors are meant to stay closed." The silence that followed seemed alive, pressing against Eli and Mara until neither dared speak. The room itself seemed to fold in on them, suffocating, the dust and shadow conspiring to remind them that they were intruders. When the men finally turned, their coats whispering against the doorframe, it was as if the temperature dropped. No bags, no photographs, no words of assurance, nothing that resembled procedure. Just a single, unspoken message, left in their wake like a poison in the air. You were never supposed to be here. The crunch of tires on gravel grew faint, swallowed by the mist rolling in from the fields. Eli stood motionless, fists clenched, while Mara's hand found his sleeve, trembling. The echo of that last look, Bellamy's ice, Harrow's threat, burned hotter than any argument Eli could muster. That evening, the storm came down from the ridge, carrying with it the smell of pine resin and earth. Wind pressed against the shutters like a restless hand, rattling the latch. Inside, the lantern flickered low, its circle of light shrinking, shadows creeping into corners like things waiting their turn. Eli had just begun to speak, words meant to calm Mara, though he scarcely believed them himself, when the faint scrape reached them. Paper sliding against wood, a sound too small, too deliberate to be the wind. They froze. At the threshold lay an envelope, slipped neatly under their door. Its paper was yellowed, as if pulled from some forgotten drawer. Its ink uneven, blotched, as though the hand that wrote had trembled or bled. No seal, no sender. Only 5 words pressed into the fibers like a bruise. The debt is yours now.